Sometimes the loudest confession is the one people never realize they are making. I heard the pumps long before I saw the water. Their deep mechanical roar echoed across the valley with a rhythm that did not belong anywhere near my family's reservoir, and every mile I drove closer made the sound heavier in my chest. I had been away for 6 days inspecting another engineering project several states away, expecting nothing more dramatic than an overflowing mailbox and grass that needed mowing. Instead, the first thing greeting me was the unmistakable growl of industrial diesel engines working far beyond the property line. I slowed my pickup truck as the familiar dirt road curved toward the reservoir, and then I saw something that instantly made my hands tighten around the steering wheel. The water level had dropped so dramatically that wide stretches of muddy shoreline were exposed where clean blue water had reflected the sky only a week earlier. Thick black hoses stretched across the ground like giant snakes, feeding enormous pumps that pushed thousands of gallons of water into temporary drainage channels. Utility trucks, orange safety cones, portable fuel tanks, and contractors wearing reflective safety vests covered the shoreline. Standing confidently in the middle of the operation was the woman every homeowner in the neighborhood recognized immediately. The HOA president wore a neatly pressed beige blazer despite the heat, holding a clipboard while pointing toward the shrinking reservoir with complete confidence. She looked less like someone asking questions and more like someone giving orders. One contractor nodded before adjusting a valve, and another checked pressure gauges while water continued rushing through the discharge lines. I stepped out of my truck and the smell of diesel fuel mixed with wet soil filled the afternoon air. The noise almost drowned out my voice as I walked toward them. The HOA president turned, smiled politely, and casually informed me that the association had approved a community improvement project to remove what she called an unnecessary private pond that occupied valuable neighborhood space. For a brief moment I honestly wondered whether she had mistaken this property for somewhere else. Then I looked beyond the pumps toward the old cedar post near the shoreline where my grandfather had mounted a small weatherproof security camera years earlier after a series of severe storms. Most people never noticed it because it blended naturally into the weathered wood, but I knew exactly where it was. Quietly, I realized every truck, every contractor, every instruction, and every gallon of water disappearing from my reservoir had already been recorded from the moment the first vehicle arrived. I looked back at the reservoir and remembered fishing there with my father as a child, while my grandfather explained how every section of the spillway had been engineered to protect the surrounding land during heavy rain. This was never an ornamental pond. It was a carefully designed piece of private infrastructure that had served our family for decades. Yet as another powerful surge of water rushed through the pumps, the HOA president confidently signed another page on her clipboard without asking who actually owned the reservoir. She believed paperwork from the association was enough to justify everything happening in front of her. She had no idea that the most important paperwork in this entire story had been safely waiting for years inside a fireproof cabinet less than 200 yards from where she was standing. I did not argue with the HOA president because there was nothing she could possibly say that would change what I already knew. Instead, I turned away from the pumps and walked back toward the old workshop that had stood beside the reservoir for as long as I could remember. The diesel engines continued echoing behind me while thousands of gallons of water disappeared from the shoreline, but every step toward that workshop made me feel calmer. My father used to tell me that the strongest property line was never the fence people could see. It was the paper trail nobody could erase. I unlocked the heavy steel door and crossed the familiar concrete floor where generations of maintenance tools still hung exactly where my grandfather had left them. Against the back wall stood the same fireproof cabinet that had survived floods, storms, and decades of changing seasons. I spun the combination lock almost from memory before opening the thick metal door. Inside, neatly labeled binders rested in perfect order beside rolled engineering drawings protected inside weatherproof tubes. The oldest documents carried my grandfather's careful handwriting, while newer folders contained my father's notes documenting every inspection, repair, and improvement completed over the years. I placed the first binder on the workbench and opened the original recorded property deed. The legal description matched every acre surrounding the reservoir without a single reference to the homeowners association. Next came certified county parcel maps showing identical boundaries that had remained unchanged for decades. Beneath those rested the original engineering blueprints prepared when my grandfather designed the reservoir with licensed professionals to manage irrigation, stormwater retention, and long-term water storage for the property. Every elevation, spillway measurement, drainage channel, and retaining structure appeared exactly as they still existed outside. Another folder contained the officially recorded state water rights, complete with registration numbers, inspection reports, and renewal documents carefully preserved over many years. There was no ambiguity anywhere in the records. The reservoir had always belonged to my family, and every improvement had been legally documented from the beginning. I photographed every page with my phone before placing each document into organized folders that could easily be shared with an attorney if necessary. Then I called the county recorder's office and requested fresh, certified copies of the deed, parcel map, and ownership records to eliminate any possible argument about authenticity. While waiting for confirmation, I walked outside again and quietly observed the operation from a distance. The HOA president continued directing contractors with complete confidence, while several neighborhood volunteers took photographs beside the pumps, smiling as though they were celebrating a successful community project. One volunteer even recorded a short video while another pointed proudly toward the falling water level. They believed they were documenting an accomplishment. I realized they were actually preserving evidence from multiple angles without understanding what those images would eventually prove. I glanced once more toward the weathered cedar post where the hidden security camera remained steadily recording every vehicle, every instruction, every contractor, and every passing hour. The afternoon sunlight reflected across the shrinking water while fresh mud emerged along the exposed shoreline exactly where I had learned to fish with my father years earlier. Looking at the organized documents resting safely inside the workshop and then back toward the people confidently draining the reservoir, I understood something that immediately changed my state of mind. They believed ownership could be decided by authority. I already possessed decades of records proving ownership had been established long before the Homeowners Association had ever existed. The pumps continued running until the last light of the afternoon disappeared behind the hills, but I stopped watching them because I had already seen everything I needed. Back inside the workshop, I connected my laptop to the hidden security camera and began reviewing every recording from the past week. The timeline started early on the first morning after I had left town. A landscaping contractor's truck entered through the main access road, followed by additional utility vehicles carrying industrial pumps, large discharge hoses, portable fuel tanks, and excavation equipment. A few minutes later, the HOA president arrived in her own vehicle, stepped out with a clipboard, greeted the contractors, and began pointing toward different sections of the reservoir while everyone gathered around her. The camera captured every movement with remarkable clarity. There was no confusion about who organized the operation or who directed the work. Every instruction, every arrival, and every departure had been preserved with accurate timestamps. After saving multiple backup copies of the footage onto external drives, I opened the account connected to my shoreline monitoring drone. Before every extended business trip, I programmed the drone to complete routine inspection flights over the property and automatically upload the images into secure cloud storage. Flight after flight revealed the reservoir, changing one day at a time. The waterline steadily retreated while fresh sections of exposed shoreline appeared with each inspection. The contractors, equipment, trucks, and temporary staging areas became more visible every day as the reservoir continued shrinking. I carefully downloaded every photograph, preserving the original metadata that recorded the exact date, time, and location of each image. Then I turned my attention to something even more surprising. Curious about how confidently the HOA president had described the project, I visited the Homeowners Association website. There, displayed prominently on the community announcement page, was an article celebrating what they called an important neighborhood improvement initiative. Several photographs showed the same pumps, trucks, and discharge hoses I had just reviewed on my own recordings. One image even included the HOA president smiling while standing beside the contractors with the reservoir visible behind them. I immediately saved complete copies of every web page before checking the association's social media accounts. They had documented nearly every stage of the project themselves. Residents had posted enthusiastic comments congratulating the board, while short videos showed water flowing through the pumps and volunteers posing beside the equipment. Every post included dates that perfectly matched the timestamps from my security camera and drone photographs. Instead of creating uncertainty, they had unknowingly built an independent timeline that confirmed exactly when the unauthorized work began and who publicly accepted responsibility for it. Before shutting down my computer, I organized every photograph, recording, archived webpage, and social media post into carefully labeled folders. Nothing would depend upon memory or opinion because every important event had already been documented from multiple independent sources. Outside, the sound of the pumps finally faded into the quiet evening, leaving only crickets and the occasional breeze moving across the partially drained reservoir. Standing beside the workshop, I looked once more toward the exposed shoreline and realized the operation had produced far more than physical damage. It had produced a complete record of decisions that could now be verified by cameras, drone inspections, public announcements, and the association's own words. They believed they had been documenting a successful project for their community. In reality, they had assembled one of the strongest collections of evidence I had ever seen without realizing that every photograph they proudly shared would eventually tell the same story from my side of the courtroom. By sunrise the next morning, I had already made 3 phone calls that would quietly change everything. I did not contact reporters, neighbors, or anyone connected to the homeowners association. Instead, I reached out to professionals whose opinions could stand on their own inside a courtroom. Before noon, a licensed civil engineer arrived at the property carrying survey equipment, followed shortly afterward by a hydrologist with decades of experience evaluating private water systems. Later that afternoon, a certified real estate appraiser joined them with detailed county maps and valuation records. None of them knew each other personally, and I preferred it that way because independent conclusions carried far more weight than coordinated opinions. The civil engineer spent hours walking the perimeter of the reservoir with a global positioning survey unit, comparing the existing shoreline, spillway elevations, drainage channels, retaining structures, and access points against the original engineering drawings that my grandfather had preserved. Every measurement matched the historic plans with remarkable precision, confirming that the reservoir remained exactly where it had legally existed for decades. The hydrologist examined the exposed shoreline, measured the remaining water level, inspected sediment patterns, and evaluated how rapidly the unauthorized pumping had altered the natural balance of the system. He explained that draining a reservoir of this size without proper engineering supervision could create long-term environmental and structural consequences that would require careful restoration. Meanwhile, the appraiser documented every permanent improvement connected to the reservoir, including the spillway, reinforced embankments, drainage controls, maintenance access roads, and integrated water management system. He reviewed comparable properties throughout the county before calculating the contribution that the reservoir made to the overall value of the estate. When he quietly shared his preliminary estimate with me, the number did not surprise me because my family had invested generations into maintaining the property. The reservoir and its supporting infrastructure represented approximately $8 million in value. That figure reflected far more than water alone. It represented engineering, land improvements, legal water rights, environmental function, and decades of responsible maintenance. Throughout the inspection, each expert photographed every section of the property from multiple angles while carefully recording dates, measurements, weather conditions, and observations. No assumptions appeared anywhere in their notes because every conclusion had to be supported by objective evidence. Before leaving, the civil engineer recommended requesting a formal county inspection so an independent public agency could document the condition of the reservoir before any restoration work began. I agreed immediately because another neutral report would only strengthen the growing collection of evidence. As the professionals packed their equipment, I noticed several contractors on the opposite side of the reservoir beginning to disconnect one of the large pumps. The water level had dropped so dramatically that fresh rings of damp soil wrapped around the shoreline, like visible reminders of every hour the machinery had been running. The hidden security camera continued recording silently while my drone completed another scheduled inspection flight high above the property. Every new image captured the same reality from another perspective. By the end of the day, my dining room table had disappeared beneath engineering reports, survey maps, inspection photographs, valuation summaries, certified property records, and organized digital backups. Looking across those carefully assembled documents, I realized this case was no longer based upon my personal account of what had happened. Licensed experts had transformed visible damage into measurable facts into professional opinions, and professional opinions into evidence that could not be dismissed by confidence, assumptions, or authority alone. 2 days later, the investigation quietly moved beyond my property and into government offices where opinions no longer mattered. The county inspection team arrived early in the morning with marked vehicles, survey instruments, digital cameras, and inspection forms that had been prepared before they ever stepped onto the shoreline. One inspector introduced himself as a specialist in land use compliance, while another focused on water management infrastructure. They explained that because the reservoir involved recorded water rights and engineered improvements, every observation would become part of an official public record. That was exactly what I wanted. I walked them through the property without exaggerating a single detail. The original engineering drawings, certified property deed, county parcel maps, hydrology report, appraisal, drone photographs, and security camera timeline were all organized inside labeled folders waiting on the dining room table. The inspectors reviewed each document carefully before comparing the records with the actual conditions surrounding the reservoir. Every location identified on the original survey matched what they observed in the field. The exposed shoreline clearly reflected the rapid drop in water level, while temporary pump tracks remained visible across sections of soft ground leading toward the access road. They photographed everything from multiple angles and recorded measurements that matched the reports already prepared by the independent experts. Later that afternoon, representatives from the Regional Water Authority joined the inspection. They reviewed the registered water rights associated with the reservoir and verified that no authorization had been issued permitting the removal of such a significant volume of water. One official quietly explained that private reservoirs connected to recorded water rights could not simply be altered because a neighborhood association believed doing so would improve the appearance of surrounding property. Legal ownership, engineering requirements, and state regulations remained in effect regardless of local opinions. Hearing those words confirmed that the evidence was no longer coming only from my side. Independent agencies were reaching the same conclusions through their own procedures. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside the neighborhood began to change. The Homeowners Association website that had proudly celebrated the drainage project suddenly removed several photographs and quietly deleted the original announcement. Unfortunately for them, archived copies had already been preserved long before anything disappeared. Their social media accounts became noticeably silent after days of enthusiastic updates. Neighbors who had previously smiled beside the pumps now avoided discussing the project whenever they saw me driving through the community. Even some contractors appeared less comfortable when county vehicles returned for follow-up inspections. I did not approach anyone because there was nothing left to argue about. Every new inspection only added another layer of objective documentation to an already substantial record. A week after the county visit, I received preliminary copies of the official inspection summaries. They confirmed that the reservoir existed entirely within the legally recorded boundaries of my property, acknowledged the documented engineering infrastructure supporting the system, and noted evidence consistent with unauthorized water removal. Although the reports stopped short of assigning legal responsibility, they established factual conditions that could later be evaluated by the court. My attorney smiled when he finished reading them because independent government findings often carried considerable weight during litigation. As I returned each report to the same fireproof cabinet where my grandfather had stored the original property records decades earlier, I realized something remarkable had happened. The people who believed confidence was enough to control someone else's property were now facing engineers, inspectors, water officials, certified records, and public documents that all pointed toward the same unavoidable truth. The reservoir had never changed ownership. Only the evidence surrounding it had continued to grow stronger with every passing day. The lawsuit officially began the following week, but the most important moments happened long before anyone entered a courtroom. During discovery, my attorney requested every document the Homeowners Association had relied upon when approving the reservoir project, including board meeting minutes, contractor agreements, internal emails, engineering studies, property records, and communications with county agencies. The response was surprisingly thin. There were meeting notes discussing neighborhood improvements, budget approvals for drainage equipment, and contractor invoices, but there was nothing establishing ownership of the reservoir. No licensed engineering review authorizing the work, no county approval, no state permit, and no recorded document transferring any property rights to the association. At the same time, depositions began. One contractor after another described how the project had unfolded. None of them claimed to have verified ownership because they believed the homeowners association had already completed that responsibility before hiring them. They explained that the HOA president presented the reservoir as community property and assured everyone that the necessary approvals had already been obtained. Their testimony remained remarkably consistent. They followed instructions that they believed came from the lawful property representative. Those statements quietly shifted the focus away from the contractors and toward the decisions made before the first pump ever arrived. Then came the deposition of the HOA president herself. My attorney carefully walked through each document one page at a time. He began with the original property deed, then the county parcel map, followed by the registered water rights, the engineering blueprints, the certified appraisal, the hydrologist's report, the county inspection findings, and finally the archived announcements published by the Homeowners Association. After each document, he asked the same simple question. Had she reviewed this record before authorizing the project? Each answer revealed another missing step in the decision-making process. She acknowledged relying upon assumptions made during board discussions rather than independently verifying ownership through county records. She admitted that no licensed engineer had evaluated the consequences of draining the reservoir before contractors were hired. She confirmed that no representative had contacted me before approving the operation because the board believed the property belonged to the association. As the deposition continued, the timeline became impossible to ignore. The security camera recordings established exactly when the equipment arrived. The drone photographs documented the changing shoreline day by day. The archived website and social media posts confirmed the association publicly accepted responsibility for the project. The expert reports measured the financial and environmental impact. The county inspection verified the legal property boundaries. Every independent source aligned with every other source until the sequence of events became remarkably clear. My attorney organized the evidence into a single chronological presentation that connected each decision to the next without relying upon emotion or speculation. Looking across the conference table as the final exhibits were prepared, I realized the case no longer depended upon persuasive arguments because the documents were telling the story themselves. The same fireproof cabinet that had protected my grandfather's records for decades had preserved the foundation of ownership. The hidden security camera had quietly recorded every instruction. The drone had observed every stage of the operation. The engineers had transformed damage into measurable facts. The county had verified the legal boundaries. Discovery had exposed the missing authority behind every major decision. By the time the final deposition concluded, confidence had quietly given way to documentation, and everyone involved understood that the courtroom would not be deciding whose story sounded more convincing. It would be deciding which story the evidence had already proven. When the trial finally began, the courtroom felt remarkably quiet compared to the constant roar of the pumps that had started this entire chain of events. There were no dramatic confrontations, no emotional speeches, and no unexpected surprises waiting behind closed doors. Instead, every hour revolved around documents that had already been authenticated, reports prepared by licensed professionals, and testimony supported by independent evidence. My attorney opened the case by placing the original certified property deed before the court, followed immediately by the county parcel maps that confirmed the reservoir had remained entirely within my family's legal boundaries for decades. The judge carefully reviewed each exhibit before comparing it with the engineering blueprints preserved inside my grandfather's fireproof cabinet. Every measurement, every legal description, and every recorded boundary aligned perfectly. Next came the civil engineer, who explained how the reservoir functioned as an integrated piece of private infrastructure rather than a decorative neighborhood feature. Using scaled diagrams and survey results, he demonstrated how the spillway, embankments, drainage channels, and water management system had been intentionally designed decades earlier and remained fully consistent with the original construction plans. The hydrologist then described the measurable effects of the unauthorized drainage, explaining how rapidly removing such a large volume of water altered the reservoir's operating conditions and required careful restoration under professional supervision. His testimony matched the written inspection reports that had already been submitted into evidence. The certified appraiser followed with a detailed explanation of how the reservoir contributed approximately $8 million to the overall value of the property through its engineering improvements, recorded water rights, environmental function, and long-established infrastructure. After the expert witnesses completed their testimony, my attorney introduced the security camera recordings. The courtroom monitors displayed timestamp after timestamp showing contractors arriving, equipment being positioned, industrial pumps beginning operation, and the HOA president directing activity beside the shoreline. There was no need to speculate about who supervised the project because the recordings quietly answered that question themselves. The drone photographs appeared next, documenting the gradual reduction of the water level over several days while preserving the exact dates and locations through embedded flight records. Finally, archived copies of the Homeowners Association website and social media announcements were presented exactly as they had appeared before being removed. The published photographs, public statements, and community updates matched the security footage with remarkable precision, creating one continuous timeline supported by multiple independent sources. During cross-examination, the HOA president acknowledged that the board had never obtained certified county ownership records before approving the project. She confirmed that no licensed engineering review had been commissioned before authorizing the drainage, and that no communication had been sent requesting my permission because the association believed it already possessed authority over the reservoir. The judge asked only a handful of questions, but each one focused on the same central issue. What legal document transferred ownership of the reservoir from my family to the Homeowners Association? After several moments of reviewing the submitted exhibits, the answer remained exactly what it had been from the beginning. There was none. As the final witnesses stepped down and the evidence presentation concluded, I looked across the courtroom and realized that every detail planted from the very first day had returned exactly where it belonged. The hidden security camera, the drone inspections, the fireproof cabinet, the engineering reports, the county records, and the public announcements had come together to tell one complete story, leaving the court with only one decision left to make. The courtroom remained silent as the judge returned with the written decision, and for the first time since I had heard those pumps echoing across the valley, I allowed myself to take a slow breath. Every exhibit remained neatly stacked on the council tables, from the original property deed and county parcel maps to the engineering reports, hydrology analysis, drone photographs, security camera recordings, and archived Homeowners Association announcements. None of those documents had changed since the trial began, yet together they had transformed what some people once dismissed as a neighborhood disagreement into a case defined entirely by verifiable facts. The judge began by summarizing the evidence in careful detail, noting that the certified property records consistently established my family's ownership of the reservoir, that the registered water rights remained valid and unchanged, and that every licensed professional who testified had reached conclusions supported by objective inspections rather than assumptions. The written opinion emphasized that no document presented by the Homeowners Association demonstrated legal ownership, authority to authorize the drainage, or permission to alter private infrastructure located entirely within my property boundaries. The court also recognized that the association had relied upon unsupported assumptions instead of performing even the most basic verification through publicly available county records before approving the project. When the judge addressed the security camera footage and archived online announcements, the connection became unmistakable. The recordings confirmed who supervised the operation, while the Homeowners Association's own publications confirmed that responsibility had been publicly accepted before the evidence was later removed from public view. The drone inspections, engineering surveys, county findings, and expert testimony all reinforced the same timeline from independent perspectives. After reviewing the complete record, the court concluded that the unauthorized drainage had caused substantial measurable harm to valuable private infrastructure and ordered the Homeowners Association to compensate me with $12 million in damages, while remaining responsible for funding the professionally supervised restoration of the reservoir according to recommendations provided by licensed engineers and environmental specialists. The judge also ordered that all restoration work comply with applicable county requirements and existing water rights protections so the system could be returned as closely as possible to its documented condition before the unauthorized project began. The decision did not contain dramatic language or personal criticism. It relied entirely upon statutes, documented ownership, engineering evidence, and established legal principles. That quiet precision somehow carried even greater weight than any emotional argument ever could. As everyone slowly gathered their files, I noticed the HOA president sitting silently beside her attorney, no longer surrounded by confidence or assumptions, but by the same documents she had chosen not to examine before authorizing the project. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited for statements, but I politely declined every microphone. There was nothing left for me to explain because the written judgment already said everything that mattered. My attorney handed me a certified copy of the decision, and as I held those pages in my hands, I realized they would eventually be stored beside my grandfather's original property records inside the same fireproof cabinet that had protected our family's history for so many years. The morning sunlight reflected across the courthouse windows much like the light that once shimmered across the surface of the reservoir before the pumps arrived, and for the first time since returning home, I could picture that reflection returning again. Justice had not arrived through louder voices, greater influence, or stronger opinions. It had arrived one document, one measurement, one photograph, and one verified fact at a time until the truth became impossible to overlook. Restoration began less than 3 weeks after the judgment became final, and for the first time since this ordeal had started, the sounds surrounding the reservoir no longer filled me with concern. Instead of industrial pumps draining away years of careful stewardship, I heard survey crews marking elevations, engineers discussing water flow calculations, and restoration specialists following the detailed plans approved by the court. Every stage of the work was documented, inspected, and completed according to the recommendations that had been presented during the trial. Temporary barriers protected the shoreline, while licensed contractors repaired the embankments, reinforced drainage controls, and restored the spillway to the exact specifications preserved in my grandfather's original engineering drawings. The county inspectors returned regularly, comparing each completed section with the certified records that had ultimately decided the case. Watching professionals rebuild instead of dismantle reminded me that careful work always lasts longer than careless decisions. As the weeks passed, the reservoir slowly reclaimed its familiar shape. Rainfall combined with the restored water management system gradually raised the water level until the muddy shoreline disappeared beneath clear reflections once again. The first morning I saw a great blue heron standing quietly near the western bank. I realized nature had begun trusting the reservoir again before most people even noticed the change. Soon afterward, turtles returned to the sun-warmed rocks where I had seen them since childhood, and schools of fish became visible beneath the calm surface just as they had years before. Even the breeze sounded different as it moved across a full reservoir instead of exposed mud. One evening, I carried the same worn photo album my grandfather used to keep on the workshop shelf down to the water's edge. Inside were faded photographs showing the reservoir shortly after its construction, my father helping reinforce the spillway as a young man, and countless family afternoons spent fishing from the same shoreline where the pumps had once been parked. Looking from those photographs to the restored water in front of me, I realized that every generation had protected this place in its own way. My grandfather built it. My father preserved its history. I had defended its future. Before sunset, I walked back into the workshop and opened the familiar fireproof cabinet one more time. The original property deed rested beside the county parcel maps, the registered water rights, the engineering blueprints, and the inspection reports that had survived decades without losing their value. I carefully placed the certified court judgment beside them, completing a paper trail that stretched across 3 generations. Closing the cabinet door felt less like ending a lawsuit and more like finishing another chapter in the same story my family had been writing for decades. As I stepped outside, the hidden security camera remained attached to the weathered cedar post overlooking the shoreline exactly where it had always been. It had quietly witnessed every mistake, every assumption, every inspection, and every moment that ultimately led to justice. I left it there, not because I expected another dispute, but because I had learned that the strongest protection is often the one nobody notices until the truth is needed. The reservoir reflected the colors of the evening sky so perfectly that it almost erased every memory of the empty shoreline that had greeted me when I returned home. Standing there in the peaceful silence, I understood something my father had tried to teach me years ago. Property can be challenged, reputations can be questioned, and confidence can be misplaced, but truth has remarkable patience. When it is preserved with care, supported by evidence, and entrusted to the law, it has a way of finding its own voice, no matter how long it takes to be heard.